The story about the federal government's investigation into the Cleveland police is rapidly evolving. It began last Thursday with a report that painted a very dire picture of how the police use force and investigate that force. It's moved very quickly into a story about the Mayor Frank Jackson's response to this. Earlier this week, his entire administration walked out of a city council meeting in protest of a call for the resignation of Public Safety Director Mike McGrath. This is the subject of today's opinion show, when we get together with members of the editorial board of the Northeast Ohio Media Group and the Plain Dealer for a discussion. I'm joined by Opinion Director Betsy Sullivan, Deputy Editorial Page Editor Kevin O'Brien, also popular columnist, and editorial writers Sharon Broussard and Pete Krouse. Pete, why don't you start us off with a brief summary of what the federal government found in its investigation of how police use force?
Well, the Justice Department found that the Cleveland Police Department frequently uses excessive force, deadly force, when dealing with suspects. It's something that the community and has suspected for a long time. There have been lots of incidents over the years where police have shot and killed a suspect or beat up a suspect. And there was a call a couple years ago to investigate the police department in its use of excessive force. It was something that Mayor Jackson welcomed. And as you mentioned, the report came out last week, and it was scathing. I mean, it showed a Cleveland Police Department that, as I said, frequently uses more force than they need to because they're not properly trained, and because when they do use force, when they simply pull their gun, they're not asked to properly account for that. So there's no real examination in the department that's going on that would perhaps lead to better tactics when confronting people, suspects. It was really scathing. And as a result of this, the mayor did agree to a consent decree by which the city and the Justice Department will work out a plan to reform the department. And as you mentioned, but it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out.
Let's talk a little bit more about the report before we get into the consequences. I mean, this was a report that said they pull their guns too quickly, they fire them recklessly, they use tasers to punish people who cannot defend themselves and are already strapped down. Citizens cannot make complaints easily when they are mistreated or feel they're mistreated by police. When they do manage to make a complaint, the complaints summarily get dismissed. The Citizen Review Board, which is supposed to be the window onto these investigations, doesn't do its job in any way, shape, or form. And the report, without investigating it, suggested that police are regularly making stops of people without having the probable cause. If you read this from top to bottom, the government portrays a department that does nothing right in any level of its use of force.
And I think this is really the most pertinent and important takeaway, that the leadership of the department is deficient. The oversight, the procedures, the realization that their practices are off, that the folks on the street aren't properly trained, aren't handling things properly, despite multiple warning signs from the 137 shots, the Tamir Rice case, the payouts of multi-millions of dollars in wrongful incidents, not all of them excessive use of force, but nonetheless, the failure to investigate the fact that Internal Affairs was actually approaching things in the terms of trying to acquit people, and using an improper legal standard for whether there should be charges brought. All of these things, to me, add up to leadership deficiency on a massive scale, and which is what underscores, I think, the troubling issue here of how the administration seems to be reacting very defensively.
Well, and there are two people that are the common denominators for the past 10, 12 years. You have Martin Flask, former chief, former public safety director, now in a higher position overseeing public safety, and Mike McGrath, the longtime police chief, recently made public safety director. And there is a wide-scale call now for their dismissal. The ministers in Cleveland are calling for it. Protesters are calling for it. City council members are calling for it. The editorial board has called for it repeatedly with Mike McGrath. and Frank Jackson still stands by him. How does that play out? If he will not deal with these widespread calls, what does that mean for the negotiation of this consent decree?
Yeah, I think it's pretty discouraging. I mean, you took a look at what happened in Ferguson with the Ferguson mayor and city council and all the rest, and how it just seemed like they were disengaged from what was going on and didn't have a clue. I think that when you look here in Cleveland, you say, well, you know, you have a mayor who was a city council person, who lived in Central, which is a neighborhood, you know, that, you know, has a lot of poverty and crime, and probably once upon a time, you know, and maybe even, you know, some excessive police incidents, and once upon a time would have been on the other side on that. And yet you see the same kind of culture of stubbornness, of I don't see anything wrong, of I mean, to have him sign a consent decree but still have the same kind of people, you know, in charge, McGrath and Flask, it's, you know, you just get the sense that nothing really will change, and that's pretty disturbing.
You know, the efforts to reform the police department date back a long time. Mike White, one of his major efforts, and it was one of the areas that he failed, was to bring order to that police department. Frank Jackson has himself complained that when he's tried to do things with the police department, arbitrators and the courts have overruled him. And that's what's surprising about this, because the Constitution trumps those things. And with the Justice Department coming in and making these findings and the consent decree having to go before a federal judge, that would supersede all of the previous impediments. It's almost like a get-out-of-jail-free card to reform the police. But instead, all the signs are that, yeah, we have some problems, but it's not that big. I was talking to Mark Namick, our columnist, earlier, and he said at the meeting he was at, the chief again, the current chief, Calvin Williams, said, we don't agree with everything in that report. There are things that we don't agree with. They won't say what, but it sounds like they're increasing the volume on what they don't agree with, and that doesn't bode well for this negotiation. If this negotiation collapses, the Justice Department sues the city, and you have a very ugly trial.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of things. I don't think that's going to happen. As strange as this may be to say, it's early yet. The whole consent decree thing just happened.
Right.
And you've got a city administration that is somewhere between driven by inertia and just plain stubborn and loyal. You know, the mayor is nothing if not loyal to his subordinates. So it's going to take a little time to process what needs to happen here. And it's very possible that some kind of a solution that includes the removal of the top brass of the police department will still happen. But it might take a little while. It might take some negotiation and a sort of a divining of the direction where this consent decree is going to drive the city. And I think once you've got those things in place, you might see things begin to move.
But you have a more or less wounded city. There are a lot of people that are seeing this report as an affirmation of the complaints they've been making and a sign that this is a city in distress. Wouldn't it be a symbolic gesture to those folks to take these two guys who've actually retired, they're double dipping, they've got their pensions, and saying thank you for your service, I appreciate what you did, but we need to move on.
But you have a mayor whose symbolic gestures are not generally focused on the public, they're focused on his staff. And the symbolic gesture of hanging on to these guys a little longer and letting them perhaps save face, I think is going to be more important to him than doing something to mollify angry
And
members of the
with our
public.
editorial today, focused on McGrath's resignation as opposed to his firing, because we think that's the more likely scenario. And one of the things we discussed, didn't really get into in the editorial, was the fact that he doesn't really have that, you know, A- team, or that those personnel in waiting who can really step up into leadership positions. Calvin Williams is relatively new in that job. I don't think he's ready to become safety director. You can't really promote from
but he
under
does
him.
seem like he might be the ideal chief for now.
I
He
think
does
he
seem
might,
to
he might
get
be a
it.
good chief, but
Yeah.
you know, a lot of big cities, I think if you go back and look, when they've had problems, they're not afraid to bring people in from out of town. I think it happened in Philadelphia. I think it happened in Washington, D.C. And I think we need to do something like that. Maybe not with the chief, but at least with the safety director. But I think Kevin's right. I mean, we have called for McGrath to resign. But you know, maybe there's some benefit in McGrath staying around a little longer. I mean, he does have all that institutional knowledge about what's going on, and if he is sincere about helping to make reforms happen, perhaps he could be some of value. But clearly, all these deficiencies have happened under his watch and the mayor's watch.
Look, let me interrupt you. He's been in complete denial. I mean, if you go to 2004 and you go to the series that was done by the Plain Dealer in 2011, we sat across from him with all of this evidence. We all did. And he said, we have the best use of force policies in the country. He's been in denial from the beginning, in spite of a tidal wave of evidence. How does his presence help them move forward?
Well, why is it then that Jackson doesn't see that? I mean, I understand the loyalty factor, but this seems to go beyond that. I mean, this is extreme.
So the loyalty factor, though, is critical, and on top of which McGrath is honest, dedicated, hardworking. But I agree with Chris that, one of the things that the Justice Department said was that the policies were fine. It's just they weren't being implemented, and this is purely a leadership issue, and this is a myopia, in denial at the top issue, and to my mind, there's simply no way to move forward without a change at the top. Now, I do think.
I'm not sure all the policies were fine.
But many of them.
Well,
yeah.
But
Anyway.
when he's saying the policies are good, and they said the same thing after the November 2012 killing of.
They said it. Yeah, the Justice Department didn't say the policies were fine, though.
They did.
Let me steer this in a different direction, because there's an aspect of this report that was lost in a lot of the discussions. Yes, the report is loaded with bad deeds by police officers, the use of tasers on restrained people. But it also does say that the police are placed into horrible situations because they've had a lack of training, they don't have good equipment, they don't have the number of supervisors that are needed. And it sounds like a big part of what the police are doing is coping with being ill-equipped and ill-trained. So how much of this is the department's doing, and how much of this is, can you say, is individual acts?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's pretty clear that they do lack the resources, and where the money is going to come from that, I'm not sure. But on the other hand, you have a city that is paying out millions of dollars in payouts. I mean, is there some kind of balancing here where, you have, a better resource department on the other hand, and then maybe you're going to be paying out less? I mean, I think the city has to think about, the whole financial implications and try to make that happen. He's been very good at, coming up with great budgets, but this seems like it would have to be a priority item.
And to that point, the rookie officer who shot Tamir Rice, now that was not part of the report, but, as it's been documented by the Northeast Ohio Media Group, that he should never have been hired in the first place. And yet he was. How many others are out there like that on the police force?
And one of the most haunting examples in this report is they come across a gentleman that's having seizures, officers do, and they get him help, and he is strapped into a gurney. And as he is coming out of the seizures, he's disoriented. He starts saying threatening things to the police. And he's strapped down. He can't do anything. And they say, cut it out or we're going to tase you. And he continues to do it. And they tase him. Here's a guy in distress. They know he's in distress. They got him the help, and they're torturing him with a taser.
But here again is leadership and organization, because the Cleveland Police, in partnership with the Rape Crisis Center and the Domestic Violence Center of Cleveland, have trained a large number of police officers in the proper way to respond to somebody who's in who's, and actually with the Adams Board, who's mentally ill. And yet, what they found when they looked at those incidents was that the trained people weren't the ones who were responding, nor were they necessarily even, available in a rational way to answer those. So, when you have the proper training, you're not actually deploying your forces properly.
I think being a police officer, though, and I agree with all of this, that it's an extraordinarily difficult job, even perhaps more so than ever. I mean, just look what's happening in the incidents in New York and in Missouri and elsewhere. I mean, Cleveland is not alone when it comes to these issues of use of excessive force and so forth. I mean, it is a tough job right now, and Yeah, this has to be approached from a lot of different angles.
But it's not really fair to the police officers who do this job where they put their lives in peril every day to send them out without sufficient equipment, training,
Agreed.
or with that foundation of the community relations with.
Where will Cleveland get the money? Where will they get the money to do some of
You
these
know,
things?
I mean, I think.
You'd
I
vote
think
for more taxes, I bet.
Oh, sure. Let me throw in a couple of notes that I think ought not to be missed. I know we're running out of time, so we'll make it fast. One is historical. Mayors who have tried to bring in someone from the outside to run this police department have generally lost in the next election.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that's a concern for Frank Jackson, but the lesson stands. That's a really hard thing to do, particularly here for reasons I don't fully understand, but the historical record shows it. The other one is, you mentioned culture way early in the conversation. I don't think we can leave that behind too easily. The culture of this police department is not found at the top. It's throughout the ranks. And having and bringing in anybody to try and change that it's going to be a Herculean effort. And I just don't know that a leadership change is going to be enough. I think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of training and a lot of practice and a whole different attitude communicated throughout the department somehow to make it look to the Justice Department at least as if they're where they should
Well,
be.
that's part of the consent decrees.
I understand that.
Monitor.
I'm just going to say, I'm just saying it's a lot easier said than done.
Yeah.
I also think, though, that I have not heard anyone calling for the ouster of Calvin Williams. So I think in that sense, there is a recognition of continuity, and
He's pretty new on the job, too.
He's fairly new on the job, but he comes from the ranks, and he at least what he expresses says to me that he cares about the people who report to him. So.
There's a lot of hope placed on Calvin Williams' shoulder. It's a good place to end. We will surely be talking about this topic in the future. We hope you'll talk about this topic in the comments of the post where you find this video. We'll talk to you next time.